$50,000. That is what Linda Carver demanded from me for a pond my great-grandfather built in 1923. Not borrowed, not shared, built with his own hands on his own land. With water rights he purchased, documented, notarized, and recorded at the county courthouse in the same year that Warren Harding was president and Whispering Pines Estates was still 340 acres of eastern Tennessee farmland that nobody had yet imagined dividing into quarter-acre lots with community standards, and a board president who drove a champagne-colored Mercedes with plates that read Board 1. $50,000 for a pond that had existed for 100 years before Linda Carver had ever heard of this county. I want you to stay with me for the next few minutes because what I found in the basement of that courthouse, one single document, 4 pages, handwritten in 1923, did not just cancel that $50,000 fine. It ended Linda Carver's presidency. It ended her husband's development company. It ended their freedom for the next several years. And it returned every dollar that 11 families had been illegally fined over 4 years of the most calculated, deliberate, and thoroughly documented abuse of HOA authority I have ever seen anyone attempt. One document, written 100 years ago by a man I never met, who apparently understood something about difficult neighbors that the rest of us are still learning. Let me tell you exactly what was in it, but first, drop a comment right now telling me where you are watching from. Because this story has been viewed in 47 countries, and every single person who watched it told me the same thing afterward. They said they went straight to their county courthouse the next morning. You will understand why before this video ends. Stay with me. Every word of this is real, and it gets significantly better from here. My name is Thomas Elias Reeves, 49 years old. Civil engineer by profession, third-generation landowner by inheritance, and the great-grandson of a man named Elias James Reeves, who built a pond in 1923, with the kind of careful legal foresight that I have spent the past 2 years being profoundly grateful for. I work for an engineering firm in Nashville. I understand water systems and drainage patterns and load-bearing calculations, and the precise relationship between cause and effect in physical systems. What I did not understand, until Linda Carver sent me that $50,000 notice in a certified envelope with her personal letterhead and the Whispering Pines HOA seal embossed in the corner, was that the same principles apply to legal documents. Cause and effect, action and consequence. What you record carefully in 1923 determines what happens in a courthouse 100 years later. I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this story actually starts, which is not with Linda Carver, but with my grandmother Margaret, who lived on this land for 91 years and understood it in ways that I am still discovering. Margaret Alois Reeves was born in the farmhouse on what is now the western edge of Whispering Pines Estates in a year when the neighborhood surrounding it did not exist, and the land for miles in every direction was farmland and forest and creek bottom that people worked and lived on, and passed down through families the way families pass things down when land is the primary form of wealth available to them. She married my grandfather James at 22 in the backyard of that same farmhouse. She raised my father and his 2 sisters in the same rooms where she had been raised. She tended the pond her father-in-law Elias had built, adding the cattails along the eastern bank in the 1950s that are still there today. Somewhat overgrown but persistent in the way that things persist when they have been in the right place for long enough that the place has shaped itself around them. She watched the subdivision develop around her property over the decades with the equanimity of a woman who understood that the world changes and that what matters is maintaining clarity about what is yours and what the change cannot touch. When Whispering Pines Estates was developed in the 1980s, she had participated in the original HOA formation as a property owner whose land predated the development, signing the founding documents with the careful attention to detail that characterized everything she did, and ensuring that her property's boundaries and water rights were explicitly acknowledged in the HOA's founding records. She had good lawyers too. It ran in the family. She called me twice in the last 3 years of her life to mention In the understated way, she mentioned things she considered important. That the new HOA president seemed to have developed an unusual interest in the pond. The first call she said it matter-of-factly, as information I might find useful someday. The second call about 18 months before she passed. She said it with slightly more emphasis, and added that I should make sure I knew exactly what the original property documents said about the water rights. She did not say she was worried. She never said she was worried about anything in her life in my presence. But she said it twice, and my grandmother did not repeat things accidentally. When she passed at 91, the property came to me as the only grandchild who had maintained a consistent relationship with it, across the years and distances of adult life. My cousins are good people scattered across coasts and continents, and they love the place the way people love things they have moved away from, genuinely but abstractly. In memory more than in presence. They accepted the cash buyouts of their shares without contention, and wished me well with the property, and I became the owner of 4.3 acres of eastern Tennessee land that sat surrounded on 3 sides by Whispering Pines Estates, and that contained, at its southeastern corner, a 2-acre pond that my great-grandfather had built 100 years ago, and that a woman named Linda Carver had decided belonged to her community. The farmhouse needed work. 6 months of my weekends went into the practical business of inheritance, the estate administration, the decisions about my grandmother's belongings, the repairs that any property accumulates over years of aging ownership. I was staying in the farmhouse on weekends, commuting from Nashville, and the place was beginning to feel like mine in the gradual way that places become yours through the accumulation of labor and presence, rather than through the legal transaction of deed transfer. I fixed the porch railing. I had the roof inspected. I cleared the fence line along the eastern boundary, where brambles had grown through the split rails during my grandmother's final years, when the energy for that kind of work had naturally diminished. The pond I left alone, not because it needed nothing, but because it needed nothing urgent, and because being near it without immediately working on it felt important. I would walk down to the flat rock at the north end in the mornings before driving back to Nashville, and stand there watching the water, and feeling the specific quality of continuity that comes from standing in a place where significant things happened before you were born, and where you yourself have memories going back to early childhood. My grandfather teaching me to fish from that rock. My grandmother bringing lunch in a basket, and sitting on the bank telling stories about what the land had been like before the subdivision. The particular morning light on still water that I associated with every good memory I had of this place. Linda Carver introduced herself on my 3rd weekend visit with the organized efficiency of someone who had been waiting and preparing. She appeared at my gate on a Saturday morning. Champagne-colored Mercedes parked on the road behind her. HOA badge on its lanyard around her neck, a welcome packet under her arm, and the particular expression of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say. She was 57 years old, recently retired from municipal administration, and she wore her authority the way certain people wear expensive things, not for function but for signal, as a continuous declaration of status that required visible maintenance. She welcomed me to the community. I thanked her. She presented the welcome packet and suggested I review it carefully to ensure my property met current standards. I said I would. She left in the Mercedes with the particular departure energy of someone who has accomplished the first step of a plan. I reviewed the packet that evening. The HOA bylaws it contained were 43 pages long. The most recent version of a document that had apparently been substantially revised several times since the original founding documents my grandmother had signed. The current version contained provisions my grandmother's version had not contained, added through amendments over the preceding 4 years, including one that immediately caught my attention. It was buried in a section titled Community Resource Management, subsection 4, paragraph 3, and it read as follows. Any natural or constructed water feature located within 500 feet of designated community common areas shall be classified as a shared community resource subject to HOA governance. Access regulations and usage fees as determined by the board. I read it 3 times. Then I looked up the location of the nearest community common area, which was a small park the HOA had developed along the subdivision's eastern edge. I measured the distance on the county parcel map I had obtained during the estate process. The park's boundary was approximately 280 feet from my pond. The provision was creative. It was also, I was fairly confident even before I spoke to an attorney, legally problematic in ways that would become considerably clearer once someone examined it against the actual property records. But I did not respond immediately. I filed it in my memory as something to understand better and continued with the work of settling into the property. Linda did not wait long. 6 weeks after delivering the welcome packet, she sent a letter requesting formal access to the pond for what she described as community recreational use pursuant to the HOA's shared resource policy. The letter had the letterhead of the HOA's law firm, which was a Knoxville firm whose name I recognized because they handled a substantial amount of HOA work in the region. The language was confident and specific, and made no acknowledgement of any uncertainty about whether the policy applied to my property. I sent back a polite written response, noting that I was reviewing the matter and would be in touch. I then did what my grandmother had suggested in her second phone call to me. I found the original property documents and read exactly what they said about the water rights. The original documents were in the farmhouse files my grandmother maintained in the study. Organized with the meticulous care she brought to everything she considered important. The folder labeled Property Documents contained the deed to the property as she had received it. The title insurance documents from when she and my grandfather had refinanced the farmhouse in the 1970s. And a separate envelope labeled Original Water Rights. See also county records that contained photocopies of several documents, including one that I recognized immediately as significant without yet understanding its full significance. It was a deed of conveyance dated 1923, 4 pages. Clearly a photocopy of a handwritten original. And it conveyed water rights with language specific enough that even a non-lawyer could see. It was designed to protect something precisely and permanently. But my grandmother had written see also county records on the envelope. And I understood that the photocopy in the file was not the legally operative document. The legally operative document was the original, wherever it was in the county record system. I drove to the courthouse. Betty Simmons met me at the records counter with the professional readiness of someone who has been the institutional memory of a county records system for 29 years and takes the responsibility seriously. I explained what I was looking for. She asked for the parcel identification number, which I had brought with me, and disappeared into the back with the purposeful movement of someone who knows where things are and how long finding them will take. She was gone for 38 minutes. The records room had that specific quality of institutional quiet that comes from being a place where important things are kept carefully. A kind of weight to the silence that feels appropriate to the significance of what the shelves hold. When Betty came back, she was carrying a folder with that particular careful handling that means the contents are fragile, and she set it on the counter and opened it, and I saw the original 1923 deed for the first time. 4 pages, handwritten in the formal legal script of the period. The ink faded to brown but entirely legible, the paper fragile but intact. The notary stamp still readable in the lower right corner of the 4th page, alongside my great-grandfather's signature in a hand I did not recognize, but that felt immediately familiar in the way that handwriting from people you are descended from sometimes does. The document conveyed water rights to the creek, and all water flowing through and originating on the property in perpetuity, with language that was specific about the boundaries, specific about the rights conveyed, and specific about the protections attached to those rights. The protections were the part that changed everything. The deed contained a covenant running with the land, meaning it bound not just Elias James Reeves, but every subsequent owner of the property and every subsequent owner of adjacent properties. Permanently and without expiration, that explicitly stated the following. No party adjacent to or downstream from the herein described property shall assert any claim of right, access, governance authority, or usage entitlement over any water feature located upon said property, whether natural or constructed, without the express written consent of the then current owner of said property. Any party who asserts such a claim without written consent shall be liable to the then current owner of said property for actual damages, consequential damages, and costs of enforcement, in amounts to be determined by a court of competent jurisdiction. Betty watched me read it. When I looked up, she said, "Your great-grandfather had a very good lawyer." I said, "Apparently so." I asked her for certified copies of everything. She produced them with the efficiency of 29 years of practice. I drove back to the farmhouse and called Sarah Whitfield. Sarah had been practicing property and water rights law in eastern Tennessee for 16 years. She had developed her specialization, she told me the first time we met, because she had grown up watching agricultural families lose water access to development interests, and had decided that being genuinely expert at fighting that was more useful than being generally competent at many things. She was methodical and precise, and possessed of the quality I valued most in legal counsel, which was an absolute unwillingness to tell clients what they wanted to hear when the truth was more complicated, and an equal unwillingness to understate what the law clearly supported. When I described what I had found and emailed her the photographs of the certified copies, she was quiet for longer than I expected. Then she said, "This is a remarkably strong document. The water rights language is clear, and the covenant is enforceable under current Tennessee property law, because covenants running with the land from this period have been consistently upheld by the state courts when the language is specific enough. And this language is specific enough. The damages provision is unusual for 1923, but it is valid. Do you have the HOA's correspondence to you? I sent her everything. The welcome packet with the bylaw provision, Linda's access request letter. My response: she read everything that evening and called me the following morning. She said the bylaw provision Linda was relying on was inconsistent with my recorded property rights on its face. That HOA governance documents cannot supersede recorded property rights that predate the HOA's existence, and that the provision appeared to have been added to the bylaws through an amendment process that she wanted to examine more carefully before we responded. She said something else. She said she had been reviewing publicly available HOA financial filings as part of her standard preliminary research and had found some things she wanted to discuss in person. Could I come to her office? I drove to Knoxville the following week. What Sarah had assembled on her conference table was not just a property rights case. It was a financial scheme that had been running for 4 years inside the administrative structure of a neighborhood homeowners association, using the authority that structure provided to accomplish ends that had nothing to do with the community whose interests the structure was supposed to serve. The Special Assessment Fund was the center of it. Linda had proposed a community enhancement fund in her second year as president, presenting it to residents as a mechanism for developing additional amenities that would improve property values and quality of life in Whispering Pines. The fund had collected $240,000 over 3 years through mandatory assessments, which residents had paid because the assessments were framed as community investments, and because Linda's control of the board at that point was sufficiently complete that meaningful opposition was difficult to organize. Approximately $60,000 of the fund could be traced to actual community improvements. The remaining $180,000 had moved through a series of transactions that Sarah described as deliberately structured to obscure their destination, ultimately reaching a limited liability company called Whispering Pines Development Partners, the registered agent of Whispering Pines Development Partners. After 2 layers of corporate structure designed to create distance, was Gregory Carver, Linda's husband, a commercial real estate developer who was in the process of assembling land for what the marketing materials described as an authentic Tennessee lakeside resort and residential community. The development concept required a water feature. Specifically, a naturally occurring pond of sufficient size and aesthetic quality to serve as the centerpiece around which the resort experience was organized. The marketing materials described the envisioned water feature in terms that matched my pond with a specificity that Sarah characterized as not coincidental. Linda had not been trying to establish community access to my pond because she believed it was a community resource. She had been trying to establish a legal claim to it because her husband's development project needed it. And the HOA authority she had spent 4 years carefully constructing was the instrument she intended to use to acquire it. The $50,000 fine that had arrived in the certified envelope was not an enforcement action. It was an opening bid in a pressure campaign, designed to make ownership of my property feel expensive enough that a below-market sale to Gregory Carver's development company would feel like relief. I sat in Sarah's conference room for a long time after she finished. The anger I felt was not hot. It was cold and specific and clarifying, the kind that comes from understanding something completely rather than reacting to it partially. I thought about my grandmother's phone calls. I thought about her 67 pages of documentation in the manila folder labeled Pond Situation. I thought about Elias James Reeves writing specific protective language into a deed in 1923 because he understood that water rights needed to be defended in writing before the moment of defense arrived. I thought about my grandmother saying I should know exactly what the original documents said. She had known she had kept the records. She had organized everything and left it where I would find it, and told me twice that I should look. She had done for me exactly what Elias had done for her, which was leave the tools necessary to protect what was worth protecting, ready and accessible for the moment they would be needed. I asked Sarah what we were going to do. She said we were going to do 4 things simultaneously. We were going to respond to the fine notice with a legal brief establishing that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my water rights and that the bylaw provision was void as applied to my property. We were going to file a formal complaint with the state HOA Oversight Board regarding the financial irregularities she had documented. We were going to refer the financial evidence to the district attorney's office and to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. And we were going to send Linda Carver a letter specifically referencing the 1923 deed's damages provision and formally reserving all rights under it, so that the legal record reflected that she had been informed of the provision before she continued any actions that might trigger it. The letter referencing the damages provision, Sarah said, serves 2 purposes. It puts her on notice, which matters for the damages calculation if we end up in court. And it gives her an opportunity to stop. Some people, when they understand what they have walked into, make the rational decision to stop walking. We will see which kind of person Linda Carver is. We found out within 2 weeks. Linda did not stop. She sent a response through her litigation firm that rejected our legal analysis, maintained the validity of the bylaw provision and the fine, and made no reference to the damages provision whatsoever, which Sarah said suggested either that Linda had not fully understood its implications, or that she had, and was proceeding anyway on the advice of counsel that her litigation firm's resources would outlast mine. It was the second thing. Linda believed, based on 4 years of operating in a neighborhood where nobody had successfully challenged her authority, that the combination of her HOA position and her husband's financial resources and her Knoxville litigation firm made her effectively invulnerable to the kind of opposition I was mounting. She had processed my grandmother's resistance as an obstacle she had outlasted through patience and my grandmother's age, not as evidence that her legal position was weaker than she believed. She had processed the polite tone of my initial correspondence as evidence of a person who would eventually yield rather than evidence of a person who was gathering information before acting. She misread both of us. My grandmother was not patient because she was tired. She was patient because she understood that time and documentation were on her side, and that a woman with a good deed and good records and a good lawyer eventually wins the kind of dispute Linda was attempting. And I was polite in my initial correspondence because I had not yet found the 1923 document and had not yet called Sarah. Not because I intended to yield. Sarah's brief was 47 pages long and included certified copies of every document from the county records. A statutory analysis of HOA authority limitations under Tennessee law. A property law analysis of the relationship between recorded water rights covenants and subsequent HOA governance documents. Historical documentation of the bylaw amendment process showing procedural deficiencies in the meeting notice and quorum verification. And the formal demand for withdrawal of the fine and rescission of the bylaw provision within 30 days. The HOA board meeting following receipt of the brief was described to me afterward by Harold Sutton, a retired attorney who had been on the board since before Linda's arrival and who had been documenting her financial decisions with the professional habit of someone who recognizes irregular patterns. As the most uncomfortable 2 hours of his recent experience, Linda had presented the brief to the board as a nuisance filing that her litigation firm would handle routinely. Harold had read it himself during the meeting and begun asking questions that Linda's answers were not satisfying. Harold asked specifically about the bylaw amendment process for the provision Sarah had challenged. He asked to see the meeting minutes from the meeting at which the amendment had been passed. When the minutes were produced, it became apparent to anyone reading them carefully, which Harold was doing, that the meeting had been noticed with insufficient lead time under the HOA's own governing documents, and that the quorum recorded in the minutes did not account for proxies in the manner the bylaws required. The amendment, in other words, had not been properly adopted under the HOA's own rules, which meant it was not a valid bylaw, which meant the fine based on it was not a valid fine. Harold noted all of this in his own records and sent Sarah a message that evening offering to provide whatever documentation he had accumulated about Linda's tenure as president. He had been keeping records for 2 years. What he sent Sarah over the following week was the kind of comprehensive internal documentation that transforms a case from strong to overwhelming. Because it came from inside the organization whose conduct was being challenged and reflected the observations of a trained attorney who had recognized what was happening and documented it with professional precision. Harold's files combined with my grandmother's 67 pages and the financial records Sarah had assembled, and the 1923 deed created an evidentiary foundation that the district attorney's office, upon receiving Sarah's referral, described as unusually complete for a preliminary submission. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, which had an existing interest in Gregory Carver's development activities based on an unrelated matter in another county, received Sarah's referral with what the agent she spoke to described as significant interest and immediate relevance to an ongoing investigation. 3 additional residents of Whispering Pines came forward in the weeks following the circulation of news about the legal challenge. Each of them had documentation of targeted harassment campaigns that had preceded their decisions to sell properties at prices they now understood to have been below market. Each of their former properties had been purchased by buyers who, when Harold traced the transaction records, were connected to Whispering Pines development partners. The pattern was complete and documented from multiple independent sources, each corroborating the others in ways that made the overall picture impossible to attribute to coincidence. Linda hired additional counsel. Gregory hired his own counsel separately, which was the first visible indication that their interests had begun to diverge in the way that co-defendants' interests diverge when each begins calculating their individual exposure. The litigation that followed was complex in its procedural details and clear in its underlying substance, which is the combination that tends to produce results relatively efficiently, because judges can see through procedural complexity when the underlying record is unambiguous. The hearing on Sarah's motion to void the bylaw provision and vacate the fine was scheduled 4 months after she filed. In the intervening period, the state HOA Oversight Board opened its formal investigation. The FBI made contact with Sarah's office to coordinate on the financial evidence. And Harold Sutton provided deposition testimony that the opposing counsel described in a private communication that later became part of the record as the most organized and damaging deposition they had taken in 15 years of practice. Harold had the dates, the amounts, the meeting minutes, the correspondence, the financial transaction records, and his own contemporaneous notes on every board meeting he had attended during Linda's tenure. He had noted the moments when questions about finances were deflected, the procedural irregularities in bylaw amendments, the pattern of citations targeting specific properties that subsequently sold to buyers connected to Gregory's company. His testimony covered 112 pages of transcript and was internally consistent throughout, which is what happens when someone has been recording what they observed accurately and contemporaneously, rather than reconstructing it from memory. The hearing was in a county courthouse courtroom with the gravity of a room that has processed consequential matters for a long time. Sarah had prepared with the thoroughness she brought to everything, a water rights expert who had worked on Tennessee water law for 30 years, a forensic accountant who had analyzed the HOA financial records and could explain the transaction structure to a court in terms that made the obfuscation visible, a property historian who had documented the chain of title on my parcel back to the original land grants, and Harold, whose courtroom presence was what you would expect from a retired attorney who has spent decades on the right side of the bar and understands how testimony works. Linda's litigation team led with the argument that the bylaw provision was a valid community governance measure, adopted in the interest of shared amenity access. Sarah's response began with the procedural invalidity of the amendment process, which was the cleanest and most straightforward element of the case. An amendment not properly adopted under the HOA's own rules is not a valid amendment, and a fine based on an invalid amendment is not a valid fine. She then established the 1923 water rights deed and its legal effect under Tennessee law. She then established the covenant and the damages provision and their enforceability. She then established the statutory limitations on HOA authority that made the bylaw provision inconsistent with state law regardless of the amendment process question. The judge asked precise questions throughout the presentation that reflected careful reading of the briefs and a thorough understanding of Tennessee water rights law. When Linda's counsel argued that the community's interest in shared amenity access was a legitimate governance objective, the judge asked them to identify the legal authority by which an HOA could override a recorded water rights covenant predating the HOA's existence by several decades. Counsel cited several cases. The judge noted that none of the cited cases involved a covenant with the specific language present in the 1923 deed. The argument continued for 2 more hours and resolved itself in the way that arguments resolve when one side has the record and the other side has only the argument. The written judgment arrived 2 weeks after the hearing. The judge voided the bylaw provision in its entirety, finding it procedurally invalid for failure to comply with the HOA's own amendment requirements, and substantively invalid as inconsistent with recorded property rights and state statute. The $50,000 fine was vacated. Attorney fees were awarded to my estate on the grounds that the HOA's legal position had been untenable on its face, and that pursuing it had imposed unnecessary costs that should not fall on the party whose rights had been violated. The opinions section on the 1923 damages provision was the part Sarah called the most satisfying piece of judicial writing she had encountered in 16 years of practice. The judge found the provision enforceable, found that the HOA's actions constituted an attempt to claim rights to my water features within the meaning of the provision, and found Linda Carver personally liable under the provision, along with the HOA as an entity. The damages proceeding that followed established the amount at $314,000, calculated based on the documented value of what Whispering Pines development partners had anticipated receiving from pond access, the costs my estate had incurred defending against illegal actions, and the deterrent component the 1923 provision's language supported. $314,000 for a $50,000 fine that had no legal basis. Payable personally by Linda Carver, in addition to the HOA's institutional liability. Elias James Reeves had written a damages provision that generated more than 6 times the amount of the illegal fine it was used to counter. 100 years after he wrote it, his lawyer had been worth every dollar he paid. The criminal proceedings moved on the track Sarah had established with her referrals. The state charges focused on the financial fraud, the misappropriated assessments, the fraudulent transactions, the funds that had moved from HOA accounts to Gregory Carver's development company through shell entities designed to obscure the connection. Linda faced 8 counts. Gregory faced 5 counts plus the federal charges arising from the interstate financial elements of the scheme and the representations made to secure financing for the development acquisitions. The plea negotiations took months and were uncomfortable for everyone in the way that plea negotiations are uncomfortable when the evidence is comprehensive enough, that the outcome is not genuinely uncertain, but the defendants have not yet fully accepted what the evidence means for them. Linda's attorney and Gregory's attorney negotiated separately and occasionally at cross purposes, which happens when co-defendants begin prioritizing their individual outcomes over a unified defense. Gregory ultimately reached a cooperation agreement that required him to provide detailed documentation of the scheme's structure and timeline in exchange for a reduced recommendation at sentencing. His cooperation was thorough and useful, and added detail to the record that the prosecution found valuable for the remaining charges. Linda did not cooperate. Her plea acknowledged 4 state counts and 1 federal count. Entered after 14 months of proceedings, during which her litigation costs had substantially exceeded the amount of the original fine, she had sent me in that certified envelope. The federal count carried weight that the state charges alone would not have carried. The sentencing hearing, which Harold attended and described to me afterward in his characteristic precise sequential detail, produced the outcome that the record supported. Linda received 36 months in state custody and 20 months federal to run consecutively. Gregory received 22 months federal with a cooperation reduction and 3 years supervised release. The development company was ordered dissolved. Its assets were liquidated under court supervision, with proceeds flowing first to the HOA restitution fund and then to the residents who had sold under pressure, each of whom received a payment calculated based on the documented difference between their sale price and the fair market value established through the litigation record. 11 families, $62,000 in fine refunds. Property sale restitution payments that in several cases were substantial. And the dissolution of a development scheme that had been running for 4 years through the captured authority of a neighborhood association. Harold Sutton was elected HOA president at the first properly conducted election in 5 years, receiving every vote cast. He told me afterward that the margin had been unanimous, including his own vote, because he believed democratic processes should be honored even in small governance structures, and a person who does not vote in elections they are eligible to vote in has somewhat diminished standing to complain about the results. His first act was to restore the original HOA governing documents from before Linda's election. With every amendment she had added formally rescinded, and a new amendment process implemented requiring proper notice, verified quorum, and independent legal review before any provision affecting property rights could be adopted. His second act was the apology letters and the refund checks. The farmhouse needed a new water heater that winter, which I installed myself over a weekend with the particular satisfaction of working on something that belongs to you and will continue to belong to you, and whose belonging is no longer in question. The pond did not need anything. It was full, as it had been full for 100 years, fed by the creek that my great-grandfather had dammed with sufficient engineering sense to create a structure that had held for a century, and with sufficient legal sense to protect with language that had held just as long. I spent a Saturday that spring cleaning the cattails along the eastern bank, cutting back the overgrowth that had accumulated during my grandmother's final years, until the bank looked the way it had looked in the photographs from the 1960s that I had found in the farmhouse files. The Cardinal family that had been nesting in the cattails since before I could remember was still there. The current generation, several times removed from the ones my grandmother had named and tracked, but occupying the same territory with the same proprietorial confidence that cardinals bring to spaces they have decided are theirs. I replaced the boards in the flat rock surface that had deteriorated over the winter. I restocked the pond with bass and bluegill from a local hatchery, supplementing the existing population that had maintained itself naturally through the years without intervention. On the first warm morning, I walked down to the flat rock at the north end and stood watching the water in the early light that comes across the eastern ridge at that specific time of year when the mist is still in the low places and the bass are beginning to move in the shallows. The water rights my great-grandfather had recorded were still in the county courthouse. Betty Simmons had flagged the file for preservation digitization, which meant the document that had sat behind a filing cabinet for the better part of a century would now be preserved in a format accessible to anyone who needed it, in perpetuity or for as long as digital preservation lasts, which archivists appear to believe will be long enough. The original would stay in the records room under conditions appropriate to its age and significance. I thought about Elias James Reeves in 1923, sitting across a desk from a lawyer whose name I did not know in a county courthouse, whose current building had not yet been constructed, working through the language of a water rights deed with the care that people bring to things they understand matter and want to protect correctly. He could not have known that his great-grandson would need that document 100 years later. He could not have known that the specific protective language he included would generate a damages judgment $314,000 larger than the illegal fine it was used to counter. He could not have known the precise shape of the problem his careful work would eventually solve. But he understood that water rights needed protection. He understood that adjacent parties needed to be specifically prohibited from asserting claims. He understood that prohibitions without enforcement mechanisms are wishes rather than protections. And so he included the damages provision that gave the prohibition teeth. He understood, in other words, what I now understand, that the work of protecting what matters is done before the moment of protection arrives. In the careful specificity of what you record and how you record it, and whether the language you use is precise enough to mean exactly what you intend it to mean when someone who intends harm reads it a century later. My grandmother understood this too. She kept the records. She documented every interaction. She organized everything and labeled it and put it where I would find it, and told me twice to make sure I knew what the original documents said. She did not fight Linda Carver directly, because at 90 years old fighting is not the tool available to you. She prepared the person who would fight. She equipped me with everything I needed before I knew I needed it, which is a more sophisticated form of care than direct intervention and requires more trust in the person you are equipping. I had not fully understood this until I stood in the farmhouse study holding that manila folder labeled Pond Situation, and realized that the 67 pages inside it represented years of quiet, deliberate, systematic preparation for a fight my grandmother knew was coming and knew she would not be there to see. She had been taking care of me and of the pond and of the land, in the only way available to her, by making sure that when the time came, I would have what I needed to take care of all three myself. Drop a comment right now and tell me something. Tell me whether you have read your deed. Tell me whether you know what your great-grandparents recorded at the county courthouse. Tell me whether there is a folder somewhere in your family's files, labeled something like Pond Situation that you have not yet opened. Because if this story has told you anything, I hope it has told you this. What is recorded carefully and specifically, and with proper legal language, is not just protected in the present. It is protected across generations, through ownership changes and neighborhood developments and HOA presidential administrations, for as long as the paper holds and the records room stands. Your county courthouse has records that may matter more than you currently know. Betty Simmons, or whoever the Betty Simmons is in your county, knows where they are. Go find them Hit subscribe because next week I am going to tell you about a family that discovered their property deed contained a covenant their HOA had been violating for 22 years. And what happened when they brought the evidence to court. And why the HOA president who had been enforcing the violated covenant spent the subsequent 2 years explaining herself to federal investigators. The pond is full. The cattails are on the eastern bank. The bass are moving in the morning light. Everything that belongs here is still here because someone, 100 years ago, made sure it would be. That is what good records do. That is what careful language does. That is what preparation looks like when it has had enough time to become legacy. Take care of your land, know what you own, record what matters, and go read your deed.